December 18, 1944. The sky over rural Nagano Prefecture burned with tracer fire and the acrid stench of aviation fuel. 23-year-old Bombardier Thomas Sullivan felt his B-29 Superfortress shudder violently as Japanese anti-aircraft shells tore through the fuselage. The mission had been simple on paper. Strike the Nakajima aircraft plant outside Tokyo, cripple Japan's war machine, return to base in the Mariana Islands. But nothing ever went according to plan at 23,000 feet with enemy fighters swarming like angry hornets. The order came through Sullivan's headset, crackling and urgent. Bail out, bail out, bail out. He grabbed his parachute with trembling hands, his mind racing through every horrific story he'd heard in the briefing rooms back on Saipan. American airmen captured in Japan didn't come home. They were beheaded in public squares, tortured for information they didn't have, paraded through streets while civilians threw stones and spat. The Doolittle Raiders who'd been caught in 1942 had faced firing squads and worse. Sullivan had heard the whispers, seen the classified reports that circulated among crews. Japan didn't recognize the Geneva Conventions for airmen who bombed their cities. To them, these flyers were war criminals, not prisoners of war. As Sullivan tumbled through the freezing December air, his parachute snapping open with a violent jerk, he looked down at the mountainous terrain below and felt certain he was falling toward his death. The ground rushed up to meet him, pine forests and snow-covered peaks that seemed impossibly remote from any civilization. He crashed through tree branches, his body slamming against wood and rock before finally coming to rest in a snowdrift. Pain shot through his left ankle. Blood trickled from a gash above his eye. He lay there for a moment, gasping, listening for the sounds of pursuit, dogs barking, soldiers shouting, the crack of rifle fire, but there was only silence. An eerie, profound silence broken only by the whisper of wind through ancient trees. Sullivan struggled to his feet, wincing at the pain in his ankle. He needed to move, to find shelter, to somehow evade capture long enough to what? There was no rescue coming, no friendly lines to reach. He was hundreds of miles deep in enemy territory with nowhere to go. He limped through the forest as darkness fell, each step agony, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the December cold. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became meaningless in his exhausted, terrified state. Then through the trees he saw a light, a single flickering light that seemed to float in the darkness like a ghost. Sullivan's training screamed at him to hide, to avoid any contact with Japanese civilians who might turn him in for a reward or worse. But his body was shutting down. Hypothermia was setting in. The ankle might be broken. He had no choice. He stumbled toward the light, and as he drew closer, he realized it was a temple. An old Buddhist temple perched on the mountainside, its wooden structure weathered by centuries of snow and wind. Paper lanterns hung from the eaves, swaying gently. The smell of incense drifted on the air. Sullivan collapsed at the temple steps, no longer caring what happened next. He heard footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps. A door slid open with a soft whisper, and then a voice, speaking Japanese in low, calm tones. Sullivan looked up through blurred vision and saw an elderly man standing above him. The man wore the simple robes of a Buddhist monk, his head shaved, his face deeply lined with age. He couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, his frame slight and bent. But his eyes held something Sullivan hadn't expected. Not hatred, not fear, something else entirely. The monk knelt beside Sullivan, examining his injuries with gentle hands. He spoke again in Japanese, his tone questioning. Sullivan tried to respond, his voice hoarse. "I'm American." "American pilot, I need help, please." The monk's eyes widened slightly at the English words. He looked toward the forest, then back at Sullivan, and for a long moment the bombardier was certain this was it. The monk would call the authorities. The military police would arrive. And Thomas Sullivan's war would end in a way he'd rather not imagine. Instead, the monk did something that would change both their lives forever. He reached down, slipped Sullivan's arm over his shoulder, and helped him to his feet. With surprising strength for such a small, elderly man, he half-carried Sullivan into the temple, sliding the door shut behind them. The interior was warm, heated by a small brazier. The walls were bare except for a few scrolls with Japanese calligraphy. A simple altar held offerings of rice and fruit. The monk guided Sullivan to a sleeping mat and gestured for him to sit. He disappeared into another room and returned moments later with bandages, a bowl of water, and what looked like medicinal herbs. As the monk cleaned Sullivan's wounds, working with practiced efficiency, the American tried to understand what was happening. Why wasn't this man turning him in? Didn't he know the penalty for harboring an enemy combatant? In Japan, such an act could mean execution not just for the monk but for everyone in his village. The monk seemed to sense Sullivan's confusion. He paused in his work and pointed to himself. "Takeshi," he said slowly. His name was Takeshi. Sullivan nodded. Thomas Sullivan." Takeshi repeated the name, his pronunciation careful. "Tom-san." Then he did something unexpected. He placed his hand over his heart and spoke a single English word, heavily accented but unmistakable. "Safe, you safe here." Those 3 words, spoken in the heart of enemy territory by a man who should have been his mortal enemy, brought tears to Sullivan's eyes. He didn't understand, couldn't understand. But as exhaustion finally claimed him and he drifted into unconscious sleep, he felt something he hadn't felt since his plane had been hit. Hope. The first days in the temple passed in a haze of pain and fever. Sullivan's ankle was badly sprained, not broken, but the infection from his head wound threatened to kill him as surely as any execution. Takeshi tended to him constantly, applying poultices that smelled of strange herbs, changing bandages, bringing thin soup and rice. The monk spoke very little English, and Sullivan knew no Japanese, but they communicated through gestures and expressions. Slowly, Sullivan began to understand the layout of his sanctuary. The temple was ancient, built in the 14th century according to what he could gather. It sat at the end of a mountain path, isolated from the nearest village by nearly 2 miles of rough terrain. Few people came here anymore. The war had emptied the countryside of young men, and the old women who might have made the pilgrimage to pray were too frail for the journey. Takeshi lived alone, the last monk of what had once been a thriving monastery. As Sullivan's fever broke and his strength began to return, he started to grasp the enormity of what Takeshi was risking. The monk brought him Japanese newspapers, pointing to articles about American bombing raids. The propaganda was vicious, depicting American airmen as demons, as baby killers who deliberately targeted civilians. The punishment for helping such a demon was clearly stated: death. Yet Takeshi showed no fear. He went about his daily routines with serene calm, rising before dawn to chant sutras, preparing simple meals, tending to the temple grounds. And he taught Sullivan. Through patient repetition and hand gestures, he taught him basic Japanese phrases: how to say thank you, how to ask for water, how to apologize. He taught him to move silently through the temple, to recognize the sounds that meant someone was approaching on the mountain path. He taught him where to hide: a small storage space beneath the altar, barely large enough for a man to squeeze into, where Sullivan could remain motionless for hours if necessary. They practiced this drill several times, and each time Sullivan emerged cramped and gasping, Takeshi would nod approvingly and offer him tea. It was during one of these tea ceremonies, in early January 1945, that Sullivan first saw the photograph. He'd been in the temple for nearly 3 weeks, his ankle healed enough to walk without limping, his wounds reduced to pink scars. Takeshi had prepared tea with elaborate care, whisking the bright green matcha in a ceramic bowl with movements that seemed almost like a dance. He offered the bowl to Sullivan with both hands, and Sullivan accepted it the way Takeshi had taught him, turning it twice before drinking. The bitter tea was an acquired taste, but Sullivan had come to appreciate these quiet moments of ritual. As they sat in comfortable silence, Sullivan noticed Takeshi looking at a small wooden box on the altar. The monk rose, retrieved the box, and opened it with reverent hands. Inside was a photograph, faded and creased. Takeshi held it out to Sullivan. The photo showed a young Japanese man, perhaps 19 or 20, wearing the uniform of a naval aviator. He stood at attention, his expression serious, his eyes fixed on something beyond the camera. Behind him, the nose of a Zero fighter was visible. Sullivan felt his stomach drop. He looked at Takeshi, understanding dawning. "Your son?" he asked quietly. Takeshi nodded. He spoke in Japanese, his voice thick with emotion, and though Sullivan couldn't understand the words, he understood the meaning. The boy in the photograph was dead. Takeshi touched the image gently, then spoke one of the few English words he knew. Kamikaze. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Sullivan had seen kamikaze attacks, had watched Japanese pilots deliberately crash their planes into American ships with fanatical devotion. The tactic was terrifying, effective, and utterly alien to Western military thinking. These pilots were volunteers, true believers who saw their deaths as the highest honor, and Takeshi's son had been one of them. Sullivan didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" seemed inadequate, obscene even. He was an American bombardier. His bombs had killed Japanese civilians. His fellow airmen had sent countless Japanese soldiers to their graves. And now he sat in the home of a man whose son had died trying to kill Americans, drinking tea and accepting sanctuary. The contradiction was too enormous to process, but Takeshi wasn't finished. He pointed to Sullivan, then to the photograph, then placed both hands together in a gesture of prayer. He spoke in halting English, choosing each word with care. "My son," he said, his accent heavy but his meaning clear. "He died for Emperor, for Japan, but he's still my son, still someone's child." Takeshi pointed to Sullivan again. "You someone's child, someone's son, your mother, she prayed for you." "Yes." Sullivan nodded, his throat tight. His mother back in Pittsburgh, who'd cried when he enlisted, who wrote him letters every week that he carried in his flight jacket. "Yes," he whispered, "she prays for me." Takeshi smiled sadly. "All mothers pray. All mothers cry. War make all mothers cry. Japanese mother, American mother, same tears." He carefully returned the photograph to its box and placed it back on the altar. Then he poured more tea, and they sat together in silence as snow began to fall outside, two men from opposite sides of a brutal war, connected by the simple recognition of shared humanity. But that humanity was about to be tested in ways neither could imagine. In late January, the military police came to the village. Sullivan heard them before he saw them, the sound of truck engines grinding up the mountain road, voices shouting orders. He was in his hiding place beneath the altar within seconds, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through a tiny gap in the floorboards, he could see Takeshi's feet as the monk calmly continued his morning prayers, his voice never wavering. The temple door slammed open, boots on wooden floors, harsh voices demanding answers. Sullivan couldn't understand the rapid Japanese, but he caught his own nationality, American. The military police were searching for him. Someone had seen his parachute. Wreckage from his B-29 had been found in the mountains. They knew an American airman was somewhere in the area. The interrogation seemed to last for hours. Sullivan lay motionless in his cramped hiding space, barely breathing, listening to Takeshi respond to questions with calm, measured answers. The monk never hesitated, never showed fear. His voice remained steady as a stone. Finally, the boots moved toward the door, but then they stopped. One of the officers said something, and Sullivan heard drawers being opened, belongings being searched. They were looking for evidence, any sign that an American had been here. Sullivan's mind raced. Had he left anything out? A piece of his flight suit, his dog tags? He'd been so careful, but in 3 weeks surely he'd made some mistake. The search continued. Sullivan's legs cramped. His lungs burned from shallow breathing. Sweat dripped into his eyes, and then, through the gap in the floorboards, he saw it. His boot, one of his American flight boots, sitting partially visible beneath a sleeping mat. The military police were 3 feet away from it. If they took 2 more steps, if they moved that mat, it was over. Not just for Sullivan, for Takeshi, for everyone in the village. Sullivan watched Takeshi's feet move. The monk was walking toward the officers, speaking in a louder voice, gesturing toward the altar. He was drawing their attention away from the boot, offering to show them something, to answer more questions. The boots turned, followed Takeshi to the other side of the room. And then, with movements so subtle Sullivan almost missed it, Takeshi's foot nudged the sleeping mat, covering the American boot completely. The search ended minutes later. The officers left, their trucks rumbling back down the mountain. Sullivan remained in his hiding place for another hour, until Takeshi tapped 3 times on the altar, their signal that it was safe. When Sullivan finally emerged, his legs shaking, his clothes soaked with sweat, he found Takeshi sitting calmly, preparing tea as if nothing had happened. The monk looked at him and smiled gently. "Close," he said in English. "Very close." Sullivan sank to the floor, overwhelmed. "You could have turned me in," he said, knowing Takeshi wouldn't understand all the words but hoping the emotion would translate. "You could have saved yourself." Takeshi poured tea and offered it to Sullivan. Then he spoke, mixing Japanese and broken English, his meaning clear through gesture and tone. "If I give you to them, they kill you. If I give you to them, I become like them. I become killer too." He touched his chest over his heart. "Buddha teach, all life is precious, all suffering must end. War is suffering, I cannot end war, but I can end your suffering. Maybe that is enough." It wasn't enough, Sullivan wanted to say. It was too much. It was everything. But he simply accepted the tea and drank. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the war, of the enemy, of what it meant to be human in a world gone mad. The months that followed developed a rhythm, a strange domesticity that Sullivan would later struggle to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. While American B-29s firebombed Japanese cities and Japanese soldiers fought to the death on Pacific islands, Thomas Sullivan learned to live as a Buddhist monk. Takeshi taught him the daily rituals, how to properly clean the altar, how to prepare offerings, how to sit in meditation, though Sullivan's Western body protested the cross-legged position. The monk seemed to find purpose in having a student again, and Sullivan, with nothing but time, became an eager pupil. They developed their own language, a pidgin mix of English, Japanese, and gesture that allowed increasingly complex conversations. Takeshi told stories from Buddhist sutras, acting them out with surprising humor. Sullivan shared stories of his childhood in Pittsburgh, of his family, of the America that seemed impossibly distant now. He told Takeshi about baseball, trying to explain the rules through pantomime until they were both laughing at the absurdity of it. Takeshi was fascinated by the concept of hot dogs, unable to comprehend why Americans would eat something called a dog, even when Sullivan explained it was just sausage. These moments of lightness were necessary because the darkness was always close. Through the thin temple walls, they could hear the distant rumble of bombing raids. American B-29s were systematically destroying Japan's cities, and Sullivan knew the devastation they were causing. He'd been part of that machine. He'd released bombs over Tokyo, watched them fall away into the clouds, never seeing where they landed or who they killed. Now he was living among the people those bombs were meant to destroy, and the moral weight of it was crushing. One night in March, the sky glowed orange. Tokyo was burning. The Great Tokyo Air Raid, though Sullivan wouldn't know its name until much later, killed over 100,000 people in a single night. He and Takeshi stood outside the temple, watching the distant glow, and neither spoke. What was there to say? Sullivan's hands had helped create that inferno. Takeshi's people were dying in it. Yet here they stood, side by side, bound by a compassion that transcended the madness. In April, Takeshi fell ill. It started as a cough, dry and persistent, that quickly worsened. Within days, the old monk was bedridden, his breathing labored, his body racked with fever. Sullivan found himself in the role of caretaker, using the techniques Takeshi had used on him months earlier. He prepared the herbal remedies, changed the bedding, offered water and thin soup. He chanted the sutras he'd heard Takeshi recite every morning, stumbling over the pronunciation, but hoping the intention mattered more than the accuracy. For 2 weeks, Sullivan nursed the monk, terrified that this man who'd saved his life would die because of the strain of hiding him. The guilt was overwhelming. If Takeshi died, Sullivan would be alone in enemy territory with no understanding of how to survive. But worse than that practical concern was the grief. He'd come to love this gentle old man who'd chosen mercy over hatred, who'd risked everything for a stranger. Takeshi recovered slowly. By early May, he was back on his feet, though weaker than before. He seemed to have aged years in those 2 weeks, but his spirit remained unbroken. He resumed the daily rituals, the tea ceremonies, the quiet companionship that had become Sullivan's entire world. It was during Takeshi's recovery that Sullivan made a decision. He'd been passively accepting sanctuary, grateful but passive. Now he wanted to contribute. He began helping with the temple maintenance, repairing shoji screens, tending the small garden where Takeshi grew vegetables. He learned to cook rice properly, to prepare miso soup, to pickle vegetables for preservation. He became, in a strange way, Japanese. His movements grew quieter, his gestures more economical. He learned to find peace in repetitive tasks, to appreciate the aesthetic of simplicity. The war raged on, but in their mountain sanctuary, Sullivan and Takeshi created a small island of peace. They played Go, the ancient strategy game, with Takeshi patiently teaching Sullivan the rules. They practiced calligraphy, Sullivan's clumsy attempts at Japanese characters bringing gentle laughter from Takeshi. They worked in the garden, their hands in the soil, growing food that would sustain them. And they talked. As their shared language improved, their conversations deepened. Takeshi spoke of his son, of the boy's dreams of becoming a teacher before the war consumed him. He spoke of his wife, dead 20 years from illness, and how he still felt her presence in the temple. He spoke of his doubts about the war carefully, as if even here in isolation the walls might have ears. He'd been taught that Japan's cause was righteous, that the emperor was divine, that death in service to the nation was the highest honor. But he'd also been taught that all life was sacred, that compassion was the highest virtue, that attachment to worldly concerns caused suffering. These teachings seemed impossible to reconcile. Sullivan shared his own doubts. He'd enlisted believing in the righteousness of America's cause, in the necessity of stopping fascism. But he'd also seen what modern warfare meant. The indiscriminate destruction, the civilian casualties, the way war reduced human beings to targets, to statistics, to acceptable losses. He'd been trained to see Japanese people as the enemy, as less than human. But Takeshi was more human than anyone Sullivan had ever known. In June, they heard rumors from villagers who occasionally passed near the temple. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. All of America's might would now turn toward Japan. The bombing would intensify. Invasion was coming. Takeshi received this news with quiet resignation. Sullivan felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that the war might end soon, dread at what that end might cost, and a growing anxiety about what would happen to him, to Takeshi, when it was over. They never discussed what would happen after the war. It was an unspoken agreement, a mutual avoidance of a future too uncertain to contemplate. Instead, they focused on the present, on the tea ceremony, on the garden, on the simple act of surviving another day. July brought oppressive heat and news of more bombings. Takeshi grew quieter, more withdrawn. He spent long hours in meditation, his face drawn with worry. Sullivan knew the monk was afraid, not for himself but for his people, for Japan. The country was being destroyed, and there seemed no end in sight. Then, in early August, everything changed. Sullivan woke on the morning of August 7th to find Takeshi sitting motionless before the altar, tears streaming down his face. Something terrible had happened. Through broken phrases and gestures, Takeshi tried to explain. A city, Hiroshima, gone, destroyed by a single bomb, impossible but true. Sullivan felt the world tilt. He knew about the Manhattan Project, had heard whispers among air crews about a super weapon being developed. But the reality of it, the magnitude, was beyond comprehension. 3 days later, it happened again. Nagasaki. Another city obliterated in an instant. And then, on August 15th, the Emperor spoke on the radio. His voice, never before heard by common people, crackled through speakers in the village below. Takeshi listened, his face ashen, and when the broadcast ended, he turned to Sullivan. "War over," he said simply. "Japan surrender." Sullivan should have felt relief, joy. The war was over. He'd survived. He could go home. But instead, he felt a strange emptiness. For 7 months, this temple had been his entire world. Takeshi had been his savior, his teacher, his friend. What happened now? The next days were chaotic. American occupation forces were coming. Japanese soldiers were ordered to lay down their arms. The entire social order that had governed Japan for centuries was collapsing. And Sullivan faced an impossible question. What did he owe the man who'd saved his life? He could simply leave, make his way to American forces, tell them he'd been in hiding. It would be easy, safe. But it would also mean Takeshi would receive no recognition for what he'd done, no protection from potential retribution from his own people for harboring an enemy. Sullivan made his decision. When American forces arrived in the region in late August, he walked down the mountain path with Takeshi beside him. He turned himself in to a shocked American lieutenant, and he told his story. He insisted that Takeshi be recognized, protected, rewarded for his actions. The military bureaucracy ground slowly. Sullivan was debriefed, examined, processed. His story was met with skepticism, then amazement. A Japanese civilian had hidden an American airman for 7 months. It seemed impossible, but Sullivan had proof. He spoke Japanese. He knew Buddhist prayers. He could describe the temple, the village, every detail of his time there. And he had Takeshi, standing quietly beside him, asking for nothing. It was during the final debriefing, in early September, that Sullivan learned the truth he'd been avoiding. An intelligence officer, a captain who spoke fluent Japanese, interviewed Takeshi at length. Afterward, he pulled Sullivan aside. "You need to know something," the captain said, "about why he helped you." Sullivan felt his stomach clench. "What?" The captain hesitated. "His son, the kamikaze pilot, he didn't volunteer. Takeshi told me the whole story. The boy was conscripted, essentially forced into the program. He was terrified. He wrote letters to his father begging for a way out, but there was no way out. Desertion meant execution, dishonor for the entire family. So he went. And he died." Sullivan felt the ground shift beneath him. Takeshi blamed the military, the captain continued. Blamed the system that took his son and turned him into a weapon. When you fell from the sky, he saw a chance to save one person from that system, to choose life over death, to honor his son's memory not through vengeance but through mercy. The revelation hit Sullivan like a physical blow. All these months, he'd wondered why. Why would a man whose son died fighting Americans risk everything to save an American? He'd assumed it was pure Buddhist compassion, a saint-like transcendence of hatred. But it was more complex than that. It was an act of rebellion, a father's grief transformed into defiance. Takeshi had lost his son to the war machine, and he'd refused to let that machine claim another life. By saving Sullivan, he'd been saving his son in the only way left to him. Sullivan found Takeshi in a waiting area, sitting patiently as he always did. The monk looked up and smiled, that same gentle smile that had greeted Sullivan on that first terrible night. Sullivan sat beside him, and for a long moment neither spoke. "Thank you," Sullivan finally said in Japanese, using the formal, deeply respectful form Takeshi had taught him, "for everything." Takeshi nodded. Then he spoke in English, words he must have been practicing. "You go home now, see your mother, tell her her prayers were answered." Sullivan felt tears burning his eyes. "What about you? What will you do?" Takeshi smiled. "I go back to temple. Wait for next person who needs help. Maybe no more war. Maybe peace now. But always someone needs help." They sat together a while longer, these two men who'd found humanity in the midst of inhumanity. Then Sullivan was called away, processed through the system, prepared for transport back to the States. He looked back once and saw Takeshi watching him, one hand raised in farewell. Sullivan returned to Pittsburgh in October 1945. He was decorated for his service, welcomed home as a hero, but he never spoke publicly about his time in the temple. How could he explain it? How could he make people understand that his enemy had saved him, that his savior had lost a son to American forces, that the war's neat, moral categories had dissolved in the face of one old man's compassion? He wrote letters to Takeshi, sent through military channels, but never received a response. He didn't know if the letters reached the temple or if Takeshi simply had no way to write back. Years passed. Sullivan married, had children, built a life. But he never forgot. In 1952, when travel to Japan became easier, Sullivan returned. He made the journey to Nagano Prefecture, climbed the mountain path he'd last walked as a frightened, wounded young man. The temple was still there, weathered but standing. But Takeshi was gone. A younger monk, Takeshi's successor, told Sullivan the old man had died peacefully in 1948, still tending his temple, still offering sanctuary to anyone who needed it. The young monk showed Sullivan something Takeshi had left, a box containing the photograph of his son, and beside it, a small American flag carefully folded. Takeshi had kept it, a reminder of the American he'd saved, the choice he'd made. Sullivan visited the temple every few years after that, until he was too old to make the journey. He established a small fund to help maintain it, anonymous donations that kept the ancient structure from falling into disrepair. He told his children about Takeshi, about the man who taught him that even in war, even in the darkest moments, humanity could prevail. Thomas Sullivan died in 1989 at the age of 68. Among his possessions, his family found extensive journals detailing his time in the temple, his conversations with Takeshi, his reflections on war and peace. They found photographs he'd taken on his return visits to Japan. And they found a letter, written in careful English, that Takeshi had apparently given to the younger monk to hold for Sullivan. The letter was simple: "Dear Tom-san, if you read this, I am gone, but I am happy. You lived. You went home. You saw your mother. That is enough. War is suffering. We cannot end all suffering. But we can choose each moment to create less suffering or more. I chose less. You chose less. Maybe that is all we can do. Maybe that is everything." The temple stands today, a small notation in guidebooks as a historic site. Few visitors know its role in sheltering an American airman during the war. But those who do, who make the pilgrimage up the mountain path, find a simple plaque placed by Sullivan's children. It reads in both English and Japanese. "Here, in the winter of 1944, an enemy became a friend. Here, compassion defeated hatred. Here, two men from different worlds discovered they shared the same humanity. May all who visit remember, we are all someone's child. We all deserve mercy." The story of Thomas Sullivan and Takeshi the monk is not widely known. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of heroism or villainy. It complicates our understanding of World War II, of enemies and allies, of good and evil. But perhaps that complication is precisely what makes it important. In an era of total war, of fire bombings and atomic weapons, of kamikaze attacks and prison camps, two men found a way to see each other not as representatives of nations or ideologies, but as human beings. A grieving father and a frightened young man, brought together by chance, choosing mercy over vengeance. Their story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can be found. Not in the grand strategies of generals or the pronouncements of politicians, but in the small, quiet choices made by individuals. The choice to offer shelter, the choice to show compassion, the choice to recognize that the person before you, no matter what uniform they wear or what language they speak, is someone's child, someone's son, someone worth saving. Takeshi saved Thomas Sullivan's life. But in doing so, he saved something more. He saved the possibility of reconciliation. He proved that hatred is not inevitable, that the cycle of violence can be broken, that even in war, we remain human. And perhaps in the end, that was his greatest act of rebellion against the forces that had taken his son. He refused to let the war take his humanity too. Thomas Sullivan carried that lesson home with him, carried it through his life, and passed it on to his children. And now, decades later, their story continues to resonate, a quiet testament to the power of compassion in a world that too often forgets its value. The war ended. The bombs stopped falling. The soldiers went home. But the choices made in that mountain temple, the mercy shown in the midst of hatred, echo still. They remind us that we are all someone's child. We all deserve mercy. And we all have the power to choose compassion, even when everything around us demands vengeance. That is the legacy of Thomas Sullivan and Takeshi the monk. That is the story that deserves to be remembered.